All right, well, welcome everyone to the new year, to the deep freeze, and to the first Design Matters lecture of 2024. My name is John Brown. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape. And I have to say, when I got up this morning and it was so cold, I thought, I don't know that anyone's going to show up tonight. But I'm thrilled to see the room is full. And I think it's a testament to the importance of the subject and to our speaker tonight that we are braving this first cold day of the new year and of winter to come. So thank you all for coming, and I think it's going to be a great evening. I want to start with, obviously, by acknowledging that we are privileged to be the uninvited guests on the land of the people of Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Pagana, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstone First Nations. And that Calgary is home to Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. This is, as I've said many times, it's a poignant place to give the land acknowledgement because we are so close to the Elbow River, the Bow River, a traditional place of a meeting place on this land. And also because this is the public library, which when we opened the building and had a smudge and an opening ceremony, it was remarked that as a library, it is a place where the public can truly come. And that there was a good spirit in this space because of the way in which it had served the public, those needing a bit of warmth and a washroom and later on internet access to be able to come. So we take that legacy of this building quite seriously. So we are here for our lecture. I'll tell you a little bit about upcoming events. I'm sure just about everyone in the room has been impacted by Dr. Mary Ellen Tyler. She was the Dean of the faculty and has been a long-serving and very active and impactful faculty member for decades and was a student in environmental design before that. She's retiring. She actually, I guess, retired on December 31st, but she is going to be giving the so-called last lecture on January 22nd, so next Monday. In this space, Mary Ellen will be reflecting on her career, reflecting on her work, and on the promise of the future. There will also be an exhibition of her paintings at the faculty in our Stantec gallery. So that is January the 22nd. The next time that we will meet after that will be in February 12th and 16th. It is our block week, so we have our elective classes happening, and on February the 12th, Isabel Achawa will be speaking, and on February the 16th, Johanna Hermé, who's a Governor General Award-winning architect from Winnipeg, is leading our Somerville lectureship and will be giving a lecture on her firm's work and also a book launch of the work of her firm. And then on March the 13th, which is hopefully when it will be spring, or at least close to being spring, we have Sebastian Gomez here to speak. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to Professor Joseline Macedo to introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. It's my delight and pleasure to introduce my compatriot, Theresa Williamson, to you. Dr. Theresa Williamson is a city planner, a community organizer, an environmentalist, and the founding executive director of Catalytic Communities. Catalytic Communities is a nonprofit organization in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil that has provided strategic support to informal squatter settlements in Rio since 2000. Theresa's NGO has received several awards for the work that they have done in the favelas, which is the Portuguese word for informal settlements, squatter settlements, and many other words that we have for these types of developments around the world. Some of the awards that Catalytic Communities received include the Brazilian Federation of Architects and Urbanists Prize for Contribution to Brazilian Cities, the Megaphone Award for Independent Investigative Reporting, the Anthem Award for Best Local Awareness Program, the American Society of Rio Prize for Contributions to the City, and the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials Award for contributions to the international housing debate. Catalytic Communities asset-based programs are created and maintained in close partnership with favela stakeholders. These programs include RioOnWatch, a bilingual favela news platform, the Sustainable Favela Network, a showcase of socio-environmental solutions in over 100 favelas, the Favela Community Land Trust, a project for land and development rights, and Favelas Unified Dashboard, a crowdsourced community research that deals with many diverse issues from COVID to water to energy rights. Dr. Williamson earned her BA in Biological Anthropology from Swarthmore College and her PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of Pennsylvania. She has advocated for the recognition of favelas' heritage status and residents' rights through several media, publishing multiple book chapters and opinion pieces in newspapers such as the New York Times, in addition to newsletters and a wealth of materials made available through Catalytic Communities' website. Tonight, she'll deliver a lecture titled Sustainable Favelas, the Key to Climate Justice and Thriving Cities, and will enlighten us on development solutions being adopted in Rio's favelas to adapt to climate change in the absence of public investment. She will also reflect on what lessons we can draw from Rio's communities for equitable and sustainable urban development around the world. Help me welcome Theresa Williamson.
Obrigada, Joseli. Thank you, Joseli. Thank you, John, Graham, Francisco, Anita, everybody who's made this possible. It's an honor to be here at the University of Calgary. My first time in Calgary, and I've been enjoying it very much. Came from Rio summer to this cold, but it's nice. I've been enjoying it. I like it when nature does what it's supposed to do. So thank you, everyone, for being here in this cold. I hope that as I go through and present what I'm going to present, that you, that I can transmit it to you, because it's a lot. I always struggle with cutting things out of the presentation when I'm bringing such a different perspective from such a different part of the world. And not only that, but our organization and my work is very grassroots. And so it's very different perspective, right? It's different when planners are talking to planners about sort of municipal zoning, you know, kind of policy level things where we're kind of talking the same talk, and often the universities across the world are teaching similar things. It's very different when the lessons are coming from communities that self-organize and that have been developing on their own for over a century. So it's a lot of new information, I think. And rather than cutting it out, what I do is I keep it all in the presentation, which you can access through the link. It's a Google slide presentation, so you can access it anytime. And some of the slides I might go through quickly, so you might want to go back to them. Some might have a lot of text, I might not read it all. There are a lot of photographs because I like to, I'm bringing a whole different part of the world perspective, so I like to show images so you know what we're talking about, so you get a feeling for it. So with that said, the presentation is going to have sort of 3 sections. I'll introduce our organization a bit after a couple of initial slides, contextualized broadly, just so you know where our organization's coming from. But then I'll mostly focus on favelas themselves, and then the Sustainable Favela Network, which is one of our initiatives that we manage with hundreds of grassroots organizers, like Josely mentioned just now. So as background, we're not talking about something that's unique to Rio or Brazil. We're talking about the global reality. This is how most housing is developed around the world these days, and actually has been throughout history. And I think this is something we need to think about. So informal settlements are nothing more than people building housing with whatever resources are available nearby, with their own two hands. And this is basically how cities developed pre-industrialization. So we often talk about them as an aberration, but just before we even get started, I just want to situate us and try to understand that this is a global phenomenon, but it also has always been. So rather than worrying about it, we should think about how to work with it. And so, just a couple data points here. 1 in 3 people living in cities today lives in informal settlements, and 85% of housing worldwide is built, quote, illegally, according to Justin McGurk. And the UN predicts that 1/3 of humanity will live in these settlements, all humanity, by 2050. And so again, we have an option about how we're going to handle these communities, think about them. If we're going to ignore them, like typically happens, or if we're going to want to remove them, like typically happens, or if we're going to have a more nuanced approach to them. Okay. So yeah, that's what I'm doing here today. I'm hoping to provide a different lens through which we can think about these communities, but very much from the grassroots perspective of Rio and the favelas that we work with there. And hopefully it'll be something that will help think about Calgary. It'll help think about other cities you work in. It's not just relevant to Rio. Okay? So quickly, just about Catalytic Communities, our organization. We've been around for 24 years. Everything we do is organized, developed with grassroots communities, but specifically community organizers. So we work with the people in the favelas who are every day trying to tackle and address every type of issue you can think of. Those are the people we support, and everything we do is built with them. We currently have 3 programs, and we've over time identified and built an ecosystem that starts with narrative shifting and the need to address the stigma and the misunderstanding of these communities, because if we misunderstand them, then we create problematic and counterproductive policies. So that's what RioOnWatch is about, our community reporting platform, and it's bilingual. It's been around 13 years. We have over 3,000 publications. You can read all about favelas from their perspective in English. Mostly it's written by community organizers, community journalists. And then we have the Sustainable Favela Network, which is where once you address some of this narrative, how do communities develop sustainable solutions on the ground? How do we support those communities that are doing that in the absence of government funding and support? And then once communities develop, and this is perhaps very instructive for everywhere, including Calgary, once you get development, how do you help people, especially people who have always been there, people who have built those communities, stay there and take advantage, right? How do you prevent things like eviction, but also gentrification? And so we've introduced the Favela Community Land Trust initiative, which has introduced in Brazil the prospect of community titling. So the land is the land is community owned, but the housing is individually owned through surface rights. I won't get into that in today's talk, but if anyone has questions about it, we can talk about it later. And this is just another slide talking about these 3 projects. I'll just add that within the Sustainable Favela Network, we also have the Favelas Unified Dashboard, which is a crowdsourcing data project. So as Josely mentioned, it started with COVID, how to document cases of COVID in favelas, and now communities are documenting water and energy data. And this is just our early history, first decade of Catalytic Communities. We are very much focused on networks. There we go. Networking community organizers. So as an organization, we weren't appearing at all. We were there to support grassroots exchanges and networking through physical community center and an online database. But then for a decade, from 2010 to 2020, our focus was on communications. We became known for talking about bringing to the public the evictions that were happening in favelas. So chances are, if you read or watched videos in the lead up to the 2016 Olympics talking about the 80,000 people who were evicted from their homes, we were involved in getting the media for that. And that's when we launched our community reporting platform. And now we're in a new phase in the organization focused on model development, so we're actually implementing solutions. So essentially, first we're working on supporting grassroots organizers to work together, and then how do we communicate and do this work around narrative, and also defend human rights. And then from there, how do we show that these communities can actually develop sustainably? And you can kind of see all these plotted out over time, but they're always present, all of them. And then a couple final slides about us. So when we analyzed the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of catalytic communities in our work, we saw that our focus, right, our goal is sustainable cities and communities, so it's the canopy of the tree. But you can't get there without social justice. That's the trunk, and that's represented by SDG 16. But then we also dug deeper and found that we can't get there without some elements that aren't quite depicted in the SDGs, like the right to roots and belonging, right? The rights to community control and autonomy, direct channels to government, and fair, unbiased, nuanced media representation of these sorts of communities that are historically stigmatized. Final slide, talking about us. Our approach is based on an asset-based community development perspective. So you can see sort of here how we tackle development, which is very different from the traditional way that international development or a lot of government investment in low-income communities tends to take place. So we look at communities through their assets, right? We identify opportunities to develop and meet the challenges based on the assets that exist. Everything is developed by community organizers in exchange with technical allies, not experts. The experts are the community leaders, the community residents, and so on and so forth. So again, it's just a slide that you can look at later, might be useful. And now I'm going to talk about Rio. I'm going to give you sort of background on Rio to introduce the favelas. And you can't think about Rio without thinking about the natural beauty, right? So when people think about Rio, typically, especially tourism, there's a whole set of images that come to mind, which are very beautiful. It is a gorgeous city. But Rio has a huge underbelly, a very nasty history, and it was the largest port of entry of enslaved African or enslaved peoples in world history. Just the city of Rio received more than 5 times the number of enslaved Africans as the entire United States. And slavery in Brazil lasted 60% longer. That history is very much at the core of the Brazilian identity, but it's rarely talked about. And in the case of cities like Rio, where it happened, it influences everything. Everything. There's not one issue that will not be deeply influenced by this history, and yet still not addressed. So Providencia was the first favela, and it was settled within a decade of the abolition of slavery in Brazil, which was 1888. It's the last country to abolish slavery. And so these are some early pictures of the first favela. The word favela is not derogatory. It's based on this plant. This is the favela plant. It's a very robust, resilient, spiny, floral bush that exists in the northeast of Brazil, where soldiers served battle. And they were told, and these were former enslaved people who had been freed a decade prior. They were enlisted into a bloody war. Many died. And the ones that survived were told that they would be paid with land in the federal capital, which was Rio. They came to Rio. They went outside the Ministry of War. No land was provided. No payment was given. They were told, yeah, just go up there on the hill. They climbed the hill. They settled it. To this day, they don't have land title. That's called Providencia today. And it was the first favela, and it was called Favela Hill. They named the hill after this plant from the hills where they had served battle. And so favelas were settled, right? There's this whole relationship to the abolition. to rural land unavailability, land access disparity. Rio was the capital, so that's where people were coming, and so on. And this is a slide I'm not going to go into in detail. It sort of tries to summarize this 127-year history of how favelas have been handled. But mostly it's a cyclical policy of neglect and repression with a few pockets of change. So there have been periods of significant investment in favelas, but for the most part, this is the summary, right? Periods of neglect and repression. And this is what's happening from the outside. Not a lot of investment by the government for the most part, except for in the 90s, there was some significant investment. But in the meantime, residents are building and rebuilding. And the focus of my presentation is going to be what's happening in these communities over 127 years when the government isn't investing in them, isn't providing titles, and is repressing them. And it's important to note that 22 to 24% of the city's population lives in these communities, and most of them live in communities that are over 50 years old at this point. So they're all over the city. This is Guanabara Bay. So you see favelas interspersed, with middle, upper class neighborhoods in the north zone, and so on. And so just going back to the earlier introduction, right? They're essentially a territorial manifestation of this legacy of slavery, where some people are there to serve but not be served, okay? And it's related, you can still see it on the maps of Rio. You can still see the racial disparity very clearly. So any of you know Rio or have been to Rio, the South Zone is down here. So this is the beachfront neighborhoods, Copacabana, Ipanema, and you can see they're mostly white, so people blue. But even there, you'll see the pockets of green, red. These are the favelas. And then if you get into the north zone, which is the sort of post-industrial, working class part of the city, they're mostly favelas. And as the city expands west, there are also a lot of favelas. Now, I just added this slide recently. I've been reading this book, Healing Collective Trauma, and it's very, I think, probably informative to every single one of us. So I just wanted to include some of the quotes here. The unresolved past is destiny, it repeats. Trauma is transmitted from one generation to the next until it's owned so that it can be healed. It results in disembodiment, and separation becomes the basic ingredient of culture. This is very much what we live in Rio. So now let's talk about favelas from the inside, from a community perspective. So what are people doing in this absence of investment? What are favelas? So José mentioned the idea of squatters, shantytowns, right? We could say shacks, slums. But favelas in Rio have been around for generations. And so we don't have those sorts of conditions in most favelas anymore. So our organization advocates pretty intensely against the use of those terms when describing what we call consolidated informal settlements. And a consolidated informal settlement is one where the building stock, access to some services, community, way of life, etc., have reached a point where people in the community don't want to leave. They want investment. They don't want to go anywhere. And if you want to know whether it's a slum or a favela, you just ask the residents, what do you want to do? Do you want to leave? What do you want? Oh, most people will say they want investment, right? They don't want to go anymore, and you'll see why in a minute. So all they have in common are these four elements across Rio's favelas. None of these are necessarily negative, right? So they're neighborhoods that develop as a solution for the unmet need for affordable housing. Now there's no outside regulation, so this means there are no building codes, right, that are being met, zoning rules, okay? So this can be a negative, but it can also bring, in some favelas, a lot of creative approaches to development that we can all learn from. They're built by residents for residents, and so every brick, every tile, every fixture, everything you see in a favela was built by someone in the community, by an ancestor of someone in the community. And they constantly evolve based on culture, access to jobs, opportunities, the city. So they're constantly changing. So you go to two different favelas, they'll be very different in many ways. If you go to the same favela a week apart, you might have a very different experience. They're incredibly dynamic places. And as an urban planner, I've come to appreciate a number of qualities that favelas tend to develop organically, right? So again, they're affordable housing, and in the case of Rio, they're in all over the city, including in central areas. So you have housing, affordable housing throughout the city. It's responsive architecture, so people build based on their need. So you'll have somebody, so this is Muzema a while back, it's very different now. But everything you see in this picture, except for the electrical wires, was put in by residents collectively often, including the underground sewage system. But people will, start out by buying a little bit of land or buying a shack. They'll move in. They'll often build around it, slightly bigger, with better materials. Maybe their child is born, they add a room. Maybe their child grows up, they add a floor. Maybe they become unemployed and they move upstairs and then they use it below for a shop. Maybe they need some leisure space, they create a rooftop terrace, or maybe they rent out another floor for income. And so they're incredibly adaptable housing. And again, there are a number of other qualities that you might address. So sometimes people say, oh, the kids are just running around in the favela, there's nobody watching them. That's not true. There are no cars and no strangers. So it's a very different dynamic to where most of us grow up, right? So there are a lot of qualities. Some of these became a problem in the pandemic. Low social isolation, intergenerational living. Those are normally qualities of favelas. They became risk factors. So anyway, there's sociocultural assets we can talk about. Those are the ones that most people know about. So if people hear about favelas, they think, okay, they think samba, they think carnival, right? So if you think of Rio and you think culture, probably it's something that was developed or is maintained or is from the favelas. So the sociocultural aspects are very well known, but there are many urbanistic and economic qualities as well. And this is a study that was done a while ago, a decade ago at this point, during the previous economic boom in Brazil. Not that there's an economic boom now, but things are getting a little better. But the average wage in favelas had increased nearly 55% in the previous decade. And it was more than the national average, which was 38%. Favelas had more middle-class residents than Brazil as a whole, and 94% at the time considered themselves happy. Now, Brazilians overall don't have these rates anymore, and favelas also. But we see that favelas relative to the nation were doing well, and people weren't choosing to leave. This is an important factor. People increasingly are choosing to stay in their communities when they become better off. So these are just some photos to give you a glimpse into different favelas with different levels of public investment. And what you'll see in all the photos is a lot of people interacting, a lot of people enjoying being together. And so, while they're born from neglect, in a sense, favelas are solutions factories. People are trying to address their needs, right? It starts with housing, but it goes beyond housing. And quickly on the housing front, everyone's familiar, most people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which apparently he never made it a hard hierarchy, so there are people thinking about it in other frameworks now. But when you look at Maslow's hierarchy, right, typically physiological needs are the basic needs, and there we are. We have shelter at the bottom, and property is up here with the security needs, the way we perceive it. Now, we've conflated these in the last 50 years in urban planning. So when we think of housing, we think of real estate, think of development and investment. But then we lose an important, critical piece of information, which is that shelter should be at the center of all decisions around housing. First and foremost, 20% of people in any major city aren't going to be able to afford market rate housing. And so you have to find alternatives, you have to find ways to deal with this. And it's not a coincidence that 22 to 24% of people in Rio live in favelas. And you see this issue manifest in all sorts of ways, like in Los Angeles, where 80,000 people live in the streets. And then, this week while I've been here, I was at a local restaurant and I saw the Calgary Foundation newsletter, and there they had a page talking about how in Calgary it's a good place to live, but affordability is growing, issues are growing, right? This says 40%, the image didn't come through, but it's 36% can't afford to rent, up from 27% in 2021. So this is a global issue. Obviously, it's more of an issue in some places than others. But we have to find ways to deal with housing that guarantee the very basic need of shelter before they extrapolate into other functions of housing, such as an investment. Now, beyond guaranteeing affordable housing, favela residents have also been adapting to climate change and coming up with development solutions for over a century. So here's Complexo da Maré, which is a favela that was founded in 1946. These are images from the 1950s. You can see that the houses were still on stilts. Okay? This is the museum. Maré has a museum. It's one of 27 favela museums and memory projects across Rio. If anything is going to be a testament to people's desire to stay somewhere and their sense of rootedness, it's the fact that they took the time to create a museum, right? So they show there, for example, this barrel where and it was a contraption people invented so that they could bring water into the community without having to carry it on their heads. So it's got a cable and they would pull it in and bring water into the community. This is from the Climate Memory Project that we've been working on, where people brought an old fishing net and talked about the relationship to the water and the livelihoods from fishing. This is Maré today. That's where this photo was from. So you can see some of the buildings are up to 5, 6 stories. You can also note that all of the housing is brick, steel, and brick concrete and reinforced steel. And if you look close enough, you'll see that there are reinforcement beams in all of the homes. People have learned to build with the materials we have available in Brazil. It's the same material that all the buildings are built out of. They just don't typically get finished because people are investing in whatever is right, what's most immediate, which is usually the internal part of the home and not the outside. So from the outside, they may seem unfinished, but often on the inside, they're more finished than you would predict. And they all have, over 90% have indoor plumbing, electricity, and water. This is Salgueiro in the 1950s in an artistic rendering. Salgueiro is very famous for its samba school, going back to the 50s. So this is Salgueiro today. You can see that it's overlooking central, sort of northern part of the city. There's an incredible commitment to the history of samba in the community. You can see here. So Salgueiro has a group of herb growers who are now on a second, third generation, maintaining the history of the knowledge of the different herbs. And throughout the community, they grow herbs and they use them as medicine. So this is from a protest, and it says, "Favela residents are not at fault." Now I'm going to talk about this possibility of, again, continuing our conversation, looking at favelas from a different perspective and thinking about, how can we get past the stigma and look at these communities possibly as a model of sustainability. So the way this work started in 2012 when the United Nations conference came back to Brazil. There was the original 1992 Earth Summit, and then in 2012 we had the Rio +20 Earth Summit, the UN conference. So what we did at Catalytic Communities, like we often do when there's an idea pops up in the network, we put it out and say, hey, is anyone interested in doing this? So we put out a call and said, does anyone who wants to be part of a video talking about the challenges, the potentials and challenges of sustainability in the favelas. And we had 50 responses from different community groups. 8 of them, 8 of them responded, eight of them were selected based on diversity of projects and so on, and we created a video. And in the end, the video is called Favelas, a Sustainable Model. You can see it on YouTube. It's a 26-minute video. And it was the first sort of attempt or moment where this possibility was put out there. And we thought that favelas could be sustainable. We could look at them in this way. And it was really interesting because we expected a backlash. And we never got one from anyone. Nobody. So if anyone wants to have a backlash, please. There has not been a backlash. So it's been very interesting to see that the video opened a lot of people's minds, but it didn't generate this backlash. And then created a demand for a network for these community organizations that were working in sustainability in favelas. So in 2017, we mapped over 100 community organizations across the city that are doing all sorts of different amazing things in sustainability, whether it's recycling cooperatives, solar power, water societies, community gardens, green roofs, environmental education projects. And since then, we've been developing as a network. I'm sort of skipping a number of years here because it's been a long building process since 2017. But today, the network is self-organized around 13 themes, which you can see here. Sorry, 11 themes, which you can see here. These are all our thematic objectives, right? So we want to see climate justice, we want to see environmental education, we want to see participatory policies, we want to see local culture and memory, value, food sovereignty, etc. And there are 5 areas or pillars, 6 pillars of action within the network. So we started with exchanges. Basically, it's bringing community leaders together to learn from each other. And we literally just did that for 2 years. And then from there, we started having the demand, especially during the pandemic, for trainings. And then we started doing trainings. So more than knowledge sharing, more organized workshops, courses, trainings in things, as you can see here, for a number of issues. Then there was a demand, okay, let's start building infrastructure. Let's show what can happen if we build favelas sustainably. Then there was a demand for research, and this started also during the pandemic because in 2020, when the pandemic hit, we had organized a number of projects for the year, and then all of a sudden, March, right? Everything stops. We moved all our meetings immediately online. We were helping community leaders figure out how to log into Zoom. And then we started having what we call these Ronda Afetiva, which is basically going around and hearing how everyone's doing emotionally. Because these are people who are on the front lines of COVID. The favelas in Rio, I'm not showing slides of this, I hadn't planned to, but are some of the hardest hit communities in the world for COVID, okay? Because of the density and the scale and the neglect from the authorities. And so these are the people on the front lines of it. And so we started hearing stories of people dying and people affected right away in late March, early April. And they were not in the newspapers, the government wasn't talking about it. And so communities started reporting to us, and several different community groups started collecting their own data individually in their communities. And then we started putting it all together in a unified dashboard. And some of the data were coming from clinics, some from communities, some from community centers, some from people going door to door. Anyway, that was how the research within the Sustainable Favela Network started. It was out of a need for research during the pandemic. And then as a result of that, community leaders realized that research is really important. Data saves lives was the slogan. Without the research, you can't tell the authority, a lot of people won't listen to you without data, period. So that's expanded into other work as well. Communication, which is what you do with all of this, right? You have to tell people what's happening. We want people to learn, we want to share, we want to exchange. And finally, advocacy. And advocacy comes at the end of this process. Not at the end that, these things are all happening simultaneously, but you need to build a lot of things before the advocacy when you're talking about communities like these, because otherwise all sorts of things can happen, right? You can get, if you haven't built the unity, it's very easy for government or officials or candidates to take advantage of people, to have processes that are, forgetting the word, but that disunify a community. Or if you haven't built out the infrastructure and come out, well, then it's hard to say, look, what do we want to happen? What can happen? Everything seems like a pipe dream. And if you haven't done research, you don't have the data to say, look, this is real. So the advocacy has come sort of as a consequence of all these other things. So I'll show you a few examples. So community exchanges, knowledge exchanges. So in these pictures, whenever you see an exchange with CatComm, with the Sustainable Favela Network, pretty much everybody in the picture is a local organizer, and they have some sort of initiative that they're working on in their community. It could be anything from the community museums we talked about to and cultural programs, to the solar we talked about, to arts programs, education programs, and so on. These are several other exchanges we've held. We have a lot of reporting on them, so you can read all about them. Trainings can be everything from at an event, this river monitoring workshop that happened, this was a 4-month-long intensive community organizing training that happened with a group of about 20 community leaders in very close contact over Saturdays over 3 months. This was a 6-month training with over 50 classes on water and energy justice research with 30 youth and 15 leaders from 15 different favelas, and the result was a report that I'll show you in a minute when we talk about the research. Infrastructure build-outs, we've done 3 major projects. The first is the biosystem in Vale Encantado. So this is a community in the middle of the Tijuca forest where the government is never going to get around to doing sewage treatment, but they wanted their sewage clean. They live off of community tourism and so on. So they went ahead and self-organized to build a biosystem to treat their sewage, and we supported them within the Sustainable Favela Network. This is a green roof, which has not been completed because it's much larger than we had planned for. This was a 6-week training with different community leaders who all went to build out the green roof in Vila Kennedy, and we're planning to finish it next year. And this is a recent, just in 2023, project where we built out a solar system in a community. This is Neil, who's the most amazing community leader, who runs a anti-gender violence prevention organization in the community, and we installed solar on her roof after a 10-week training, which 120 different community leaders participated. So all the work in the network is, it's not just training for a few people, it's not just an installation for one organization. We try to bring everyone along for the ride with everything we do so that the whole network is learning as much as possible, even if only one solar system is being installed. So on the research front, I showed the course. The result of the 6-month course was the Water and Energy Justice in Favelas reports. Data were collected by community leaders and youth. And that has led us into the advocacy. I'll show you in a minute. Here's the Climate Memory Project. I love this work. It's so amazing to be a part of this. So the Sustainable Favela Network Culture and Memory Working Group had this amazing idea to look at the memory of climate in the favelas. So we have these full-day round discussion groups where community leaders identify 30 to 50 people from the community who are either old-time residents, founders of the community, or activists who know the history. They get them together. We have a series of discussions. Everything gets, all the conversation gets documented, transcribed, videoed, etc. And then we produce a joint exhibition which has banners and a timeline and videos, an interactive map, and then brings the discussion to other communities. We were just recently at the Federal University of Rio presenting this work. Communications, all of the different initiatives are always being reported on, and through media, through videos, YouTube, social media. On advocacy, one of the first initiatives was during the pandemic. We actually hosted a debate with the mayoral candidates of Rio, and Sustainable Favela Network leaders put out the questions, and the candidates had to respond. And there was a rule that had to be pro-positive. Nobody could attack each other. It couldn't be negative. It had to be focused on positive, on ideas, right? What they were going to do with favelas. And it was our first sort of work around advocacy within the network. And then just now, at the end of November, Sustainable Favela Network, we took 100 community leaders who had done the water and energy justice research to the state assembly where Dani Monteiro, who is a state assemblywoman, was holding a hearing on water access. So, before we go to questions, I'm going to do some concluding, more provocations. I'm throwing some big slides at you at first, just because I wanted to include them and I thought this was the best place. This is just, again, another slide for you to reflect on later if it's useful. But basically, one of the things that we identified in our work over the years is that there's a problem when people frame informality as the absence of formality. So then you think of an informal settlement as lacking. By its nature, it's lacking something. It is the non-formal. It needs to be formalized, is the inclusion. But the reality is these are two different logic structures. They're two different ways of life. And they both have qualities. And so the formal city, right? You think about it, we regulate things, we limit the complexity of things so that they're more organized and comprehensible. Well, in the informal city, the lack of regulation, and if you see this over time, leads to increasing complexity. I'm going to show you that this might be provoked, that this might not be a bad thing always. Typically in the formal city, we think of financial bureaucratic barriers. In the informal city, those can actually be removed through relationships. So a lot of things can just get done. Centralized, status-based master planning in the formal city, right? This leads to large-scale, fixed, uniform, and inflexible outcomes. Think of like highways. Think of cities built around cars. Like we built this big system, and it's stuck. It's very hard to get out of. So in an informal community, things are adaptive, iterative. It might provide a little bit of flexibility. Maybe there are ways to mix some of these things together to get better outcomes in cities. Again, it's a provocation. I don't have a solution or an answer. I just think it's important for us to reflect. I'll just mention this one too. In the formal city, pretty much everything's monetized. It's all about money exchange. In the informal city, a lot of things are demonetized. A lot of things are done through exchange, through mutual support. And especially if you're living in poverty, a lot of these things can be beneficial, and they can help you break out of poverty. So over time, these communities become increasingly complex. So I'm going back to that particular element of the previous slide, the first one, okay? And complexity can be a hallmark of adaptability and resiliency. So what made me think of this is, it's a very confusing set of slides that I borrowed from David Krakauer of the Santa Fe Institute. So the Santa Fe Institute is an institute that focuses on studying complex systems. And he uses this slide to talk about how there's essentially a level of randomness or chaos in nature that produces that if you as you get more complex and more chaotic, there is a sweet spot where you get an adaptive ecosystem, for example. Think about an ecosystem where you have the more diversity typically, et cetera. You have a little bit more resiliency built in. You start losing certain species, you start losing certain elements, it gets too simple, you lose some of that resiliency. And he applied the same principle to art, and this was his slide, to sort of show this in maybe a more palatable way. And then, with his permission, I'm applying it to human settlements to suggest that maybe some favelas could be at a sweet spot. I'm not sure, I don't know which ones I would say. I think the residents would have to say. But it would be somewhere where you have that spontaneous, that resilient, that exciting kind of adaptation that's happening within these communities, but without it getting to a point of chaos and density where you've lost those qualities. So these are just some provocations again. And what can favelas teach planners, right? I think that as planners, we should be more focused on developing spaces that encourage spontaneous activities, that stimulate highly social exchanges and creative solutions, and then learn, and then we can observe those and support those. There are examples of planners doing this already in different parts of the world, But basically, and you probably have some in Calgary. Okay. And, but basically it's the idea that rather than coming in and designing something from our own minds, that we design something that will encourage people to be creative and spontaneous, and then from there we can see what works, and we're going to get ideas, and we're going to be able to build on that and make it even more effective, productive for society and for our cities. And then just finally, it's important to drop the double standards, right? So I mentioned at the very beginning that cities developed informally. That's sort of how things always happened until we started developing all the rules that we now have. And you know, you can see in the UNESCO descriptions of places like Valparaiso, the urban fabric adapted to the hillsides was part of why they got UNESCO status. And you see similar things for Santorini and other parts of the world. These are some pictures I took in Favela and Santorini, Favela, Santorini, just to get us thinking a little bit about some of the double standards that we apply. And then I just brought a Canadian, not the same thing, but just something to, again, a provocation. Canadian example where we have architectural architecturally awarded wonder, right? That is regarded both as a success and a failure, but for redefining urban living and for becoming a very successful co-op, but at the same time ultimately failing to revolutionize affordable housing. And of course, favelas are providing affordable housing. So what if we invested in decentralized planning where communities control their destiny and technical allies are there to support their vision? And what if we employed iterative, experimental, adaptive planning, building small with communities, observing and evaluating the results, adjusting, adding, expanding, and multiplying by example? And then back to Rio, what if Rio could set an example for the world, right? So we could realize this legacy, this history of the city that's probably the most known in the whole world for its informal settlements. And instead of pretending they're not there, wanting to remove them, really recognizing their importance and their history and integrating them fully in ways that recognize their community assets. And we need that because, as I said, the UN predicts a third of humanity will live in these communities. So these are some readings, some articles that I wrote about these issues that might be useful. And these are Catalytic Communities' monthly or quarterly publications that you can sign up for, where we put out information in English that will expand on some of the things that I've been sharing with you today. So I'm excited for questions, and thank you everyone for your attention.
Thanks for the great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And what a great insight into informal neighborhoods. I just have one question here. We talked about like positive side of informal neighborhoods. My question is about the time of crisis, like an earthquake or landslide, especially because they are built on hills. What are the strategies to help these neighborhoods in time of crisis, like earthquake or fire? Because the roofs and roads are too narrow in some of the pictures that you showed, and I just want to know about those strategies that you have in your project.
So, well, currently within the Sustainable Favela Network, there are communities that are affected that are likely to have landslide risk. They've been fighting for a long time just to show you what the context in Brazil, how complicated it is in Rio. Since 2012, there's been federal money set aside for Rio, sitting there waiting for the mayor to say, send it over, for hillside containment in favela areas. But the mayor does not request the money because, like I said, we live in a context where we maintain this precariousness essentially as a way to keep these communities, keeping these communities precarious allows them to be moved around, allows them to continue with the question mark of whether they're going to be able to remain, even though we're talking about generations at this point. So most people in favelas do not want to leave, and this is a real risk because some people will be at risk. And so what's happened is it's created this situation where a lot of communities could be, a lot of hillside communities would be safe with these engineering interventions. And so residents know that, and so they fight to stay there because they want the intervention, they don't want to leave. But if in the meantime the landslide comes, then the city will have that as an excuse to evict the whole neighborhood. So this is how people's lives are kept in a state of imbalance. And so there might be places where it really is risky, but because of this history of distrust in the authorities and so on, even some places where it might even be risky and you can't do containment, right? But we don't know because nobody trusts the government around these issues, because we've seen enough situations where the government removed people and then, for example, middle upper class housing was built, or they suspect that that's the plan. So yeah, right now we're trying to fight for those investments to happen, but in the middle to long term there's a real risk. And historically landslides have happened, and in the climate memory work we uncovered a lot of this trauma. Yeah.
I think I have a fairly basic question, but you mentioned community leaders a couple of times, and I'm wondering what the comparable would be as far as is that more like the community association board of directors, or is that something like a ward councilor? And I realize it's probably not as official, it's politically voted in, but what would you compare that to? And then how is that position staff functioning?
So when our organization works with community leaders, we usually just community organizers, broadly speaking. We're talking about anyone who's working on behalf of their community. So anyone who's working to improve the outcomes for other residents. So they may be the president of a residents association, but they may also be a woman who takes kids on field trips on the weekend, or who runs a local daycare center. It's typically not an elected community leader. There are people from favelas that have been elected to public office, and there's a growing trend. It's still anywhere near reflective of the population, but there is a growing trend. Within our work, those people are community leaders, but we're set up to help community leaders who aren't as connected as that, right? So those people will often become allies in the work that we're doing. Yeah.
Hi. I'd be curious to know what you've found about the nature of public open spaces in favelas, and how communities in these informal settlements might come together to manage and establish these types of spaces.
Yeah. So as favelas densify, typically everything gets gobbled up because housing is number one. But some communities have managed to keep, there are 1,000 favelas in Rio, right? And they range from 10 houses to 200,000, right? So they're very diverse. And some favelas are quite green. They've kept a lot of their vegetation. I mentioned the wet husk herbs throughout. And some will reclaim spaces when they're abandoned to do this work, and that's starting to happen a bit more now. When there's a space that's sort of sitting there, a local organization or group will, and often with younger leaders, they've organized themselves as collectives. They call themselves coletivos rather than forming an association or organization, because they want to do this more horizontal organizing. And they'll do some sort of action to occupy the space and use the space. Often it's community gardens are really a more accessible option to do that kind of work, but there have been attempts to do other more elaborate public spaces as well. But yeah, it's something that's sort of starting to happen more after this history of densifying.
I wanted to ask about policing in the community. Is that formal or informal? Or is there protection rackets that help people out? And how does the crime rate compare to outside of the favelas?
Yeah, thank you. So we got through a whole hour talking about favelas almost without talking about crime, which makes me happy because that's not what defines them. And unfortunately, as you would expect, communities like this are easy targets. They're easy places to occupy and use as a stronghold for criminal activity. So and I mentioned there are 1,000 favelas. So I don't know what the current percentage is, but it's, I don't know, probably 30-40% of favelas have drug traffickers. 30 or 40% will have militias, which are maybe, I think they're overtaking the drug traffickers, which are these off-duty police militias, mafias. They are more dangerous than drug traffickers because they are people of the law that are beside the law, so they're not at risk from the authorities in the same way. And so those communities that are run by those different groups, they have their own, they have kind of laws that apply internally, and then there's some favelas that don't have either. The official police that is theoretically charged with providing for public safety, they don't tend to see favelas as places where they're there to provide for public safety. They see favelas as the place that they're trying to, that I mentioned policies of neglect and repression. A lot of the repression is police. And going back to the history, the state police in Rio, which is the military police, which is the main police in Rio, they were established 200 years ago when Napoleon invaded Portugal, just to give you an idea. Napoleon invaded Portugal, the Portuguese throne went to Rio. They governed all of the Portuguese colonies for a number of years from Rio. That's when they created the military police. To this day, it's the same emblem. And it was set up to, protect the aristocracy, and so on. It was set up to repress enslaved people who might try to flee, and it was to protect private property, etc. And just kind of fast forward 200 years, and it's very similar. And so favelas are seen as that group of people who are trying to keep in their place. And so the militias are even go down a whole rabbit hole there.
Hi, thank you, first of all. My question is more about the future for the Favela Network, specifically out of all the grassroots, because it obviously operates in a very grassroots context outside of formal institutions, formal government. However, with the success cases that you shared, have any of those practices or policies made their way to legal documents like government, planning department policies, if they have or haven't, and is that something that the network aspires to? That do you see it as a positive, as a negative? Would you rather stay in the grassroots area, or kind of what are those long-term, high-level objectives in the future for the network?
Yeah, those have been some of the questions we've been struggling with the last couple of years as we've been developing. Definitely moving more into advocacy. I talked about, in fact, this year there's going to be even more, but not compromising the grassroots nature, and understanding that the solutions need to be developed. And none of the sort of general framework will be changed. That's not the idea. But the idea is to then, go to the authorities and say, now we have. This is why I mentioned it was important to have the examples, have the data, because then it's community leaders showing up at the authorities and saying, this is what we need, rather than the authorities saying, why don't we do this project? Or, well, we're coming in with this idea. Communities are coming with them. Now, with that said, we've had the one legislative victory we've had, and this isn't within the Sustainable Favela Network, it's within another project, which is the Community Land Trust project. So we just got Community Land Trust passed in Rio's new master plan as a recommended instrument for land regularization. It hasn't happened yet. It's still going to be a huge struggle in Brazil. Just getting something on the law doesn't mean very much, but it's a huge, right? Brazil has some amazing laws. In fact, we have a constitutional 5 years for adverse possession. So in theory, all the favelas should have title. Just to show that laws don't necessarily mean much, but we understand that having it in the master plan is an important step to sort of being able to get it through other channels and encourage communities to see it as an option and so on. So that's been a victory. And then within the Sustainable Favela Network itself, the water and energy rights research, that's been leading more down an advocacy path. I showed the public hearing. And this year we're taking a delegation of about 20 community leaders to Brasília, to the capital, to talk with the National Energy Commission and to talk to the National Regulatory Agency for Energy to push for solar energy in favelas. So we're starting to take those steps, but not giving up on any of the way we approach things, but just sort of taking that step as well.
Thank you again. I thought that the slide where you're talking about the level of randomness, really interesting and really inspiring. And it seems like there would be a lot of work required to get that sort of regularized, what you're calling formal planning, a little bit more loose, a little bit more adaptive. I'm curious what you think would be required or is happening on the ground to stop it going in the other direction, to make sure that those favelas are staying in that sweet spot without going too much into that chaos.
Yeah, that's the risk, and in some ways it seems, I don't like to attribute anything to individuals and say that's what they want, because I really believe these are historical processes. And of course, there are some people who are badly intentioned, but I think we're living like a collective, situation here. But you do see very much some favelas where the residents themselves are like, well, back to the question about landslide. In Rocinha, the largest favela, which has 200,000 people, when we did the climate memory circles, a number of people expressed fear that a certain section of the community was just gonna fall. They're like, it's just gotten too dense. And so that is the kind of situation where, in a way, you see, how do you get to this? Well, ideally, it's not that you let it be informal ideally we don't have informal in the beginning sense, right? The slums, the shanty towns, the communities where people want out, all they want is housing. Ideally, we don't have that. Ideally, people have affordable housing. Ideally, we're learning from this so that we build cities that have some of these adaptive elements and give people some of the ability to adapt their housing and create community and so on. But once you do have consolidated informal settlements, then you have to think of them very differently, and then you have to find ways to retrofit and invest in them so that people can stay there and continue to develop and continue to benefit from all that they've already built. And so there is that level of sweet spot, and then there's this other side, which has to be managed with the community. I mean, I think when we get to the point where there are communities where there's a real process of support from outside allies and with support from the government allows communities to plan properly, you're going to have people self-selecting to move within the community or to leave a certain area. In fact, I didn't mention this, our inspiration for our Community Land Trust project is from Puerto Rico. There are 8 favelas in San Juan who decided to, when the government said we want to give you title, they said, we're next to the banking district. The people who got title were gentrified out. That area, it affected the whole community in this way, or us, etc. And so they did research and they decided to introduce legislation and create a community land trust. And then because the community is self-organizing the land, the people want to move. The people who are at risk want to move. They're like, we're right by the river. We don't want any more flooding. And so the Community Land Trust identifies houses within the community, identifies options within the community. They relocate within the community. They don't lose that history. They get better housing. So there are ways to create a process where you can address planning within an informal settlement and have it develop and do all of these sorts of things that need to be done.
Thanks again for an awesome presentation, and thank you for sharing it. I've already fired up the link on my phone so I can review this later. What about Calgary? We have a very formalized system here. What you're talking about is so inspiring, and I definitely see so much value in deformalizing our process and allowing for informal development to happen, especially considering, as you noticed, affordability is something we're definitely losing here in terms of home ownership or even renting. So recognizing that we are a very bureaucratic society here and everything seems more so top-down. Even housing strategies, there's an organized group that's doing what they can, but it's, we have an official housing strategy, and that's kind of what directs affordable housing. What can we do? Where can we start to try to encourage or even lobby for informal development?
I have no idea, because I don't know Calgary very well. I've been here since Monday. But I think in general, I mentioned, trying to create spaces where you can watch some of these processes. That's a different thing. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, somebody raised their hand. I don't know if because she has a solution, an answer. Do you have an answer to this question?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Maybe before you go into that point, I also wanted to contribute to that conversation because I come from Mexico where we have similar processes, and now I've been in Calgary for 19 years or so. And it's this access of land that is real problematic in terms of our communities back in Latin America, right? While here, all of the land has been parceled out, right, in this settlement process of colonization. So it's a very different background, historic background that we have here. But in the previous question, we was answering about how do you have more of this land trust. This communal ownership of the land is something that is maybe something we have to introduce more in our radar of how we go about developing our land, rather than very much the individual parcel, individual ownership. But yeah, I think that's a way to start.
I'm from Ecuador, and we also have some sort of favelas there. But one thing that I see, the biggest difference between Calgary is that you guys value a lot of anybody working here, and you try to get everybody paid equally. And that's something that doesn't really happen in developing countries. Therefore, how some favelas can be developed more easily there, because handwork is very cheap, and normally people who are living in favelas, or at least for the Ecuadorian case, they might be workers and they're underpaid, so they just have friends around. And I have another question: how do they gather their materials, and how do they pay for the materials? Because if they're buying concrete or reinforced steel, how do they acquire those materials? Do they have enough resources for that? Or they just make it cheaper by mixing sand and some concrete mix or something like that?
Well, most people are working, within a favela, you'll see various levels of development, right? So you might see a family that might be there 15, 20 years and still in a one-room, what you would describe as a shack. And then next door, there might be a house that's 5 stories, and they might have been settled at the same time. And it'll depend on the economics of that family, what they were able to achieve and buy. Often they'll physically do the work themselves, but now increasingly, somebody in the communities, the construction worker, someone else might hire their neighbor. Building materials, so they do buy the building materials. Often you'll see, I always say it's a healthy favela if you see building materials all outside in the houses and you know that it's moving, because the time when you don't see that is when people are threatened with eviction, and then everyone stops. Sometimes the government will say, if you build, then we're going to remove you, except that's not true. But they'd give them misinformation, and then people might sit 3-4 years without any construction, and the house starts, the quality goes down, and then it's easier to remove them. So the government, it's very complicated, very nocive. But anyway, so the materials they're typically more expensive to get into favelas that are on hills, because you have to pay people to take it up. typically people will, this is an article research we've been wanting to do for years, people will rebuild a house over generations. So probably the expense going to building a house in a favela is much higher, not only because of taking materials up, but because they don't have like a loan, they can't take out a loan and just build. So there's this rebuilding and then learning skills and then improving. And so I mentioned the embedded history because of that process, right? There's a lot going into the house that you don't see from the outside. But yeah, so materials are complicated. I mean, going back to the question on informality and how we can bring it in. I mean, I know there's more to talk about with that. I just can't think, it's not at the top of my mind. And yes, there are the problems with that come from our context in Latin America that, you know, fortunately aren't here. But there are qualities that come with that. I think it's very much related to the issue of money. And we've basically built societies that money is value. And going back to Maslow's pyramid, if we look at it in more detail, right? Everything on the first two rungs is paid. Everything above can't be. You can't pay for community or love, affection, realization, blah, 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 all of those good things. But we've created a whole system, structure, where to get access to the basics, you got to pay for water, you got to pay for housing, land. So there's something, just in my opinion, very unjust in the whole structure of how we've set ourselves up for humans to lead fulfilling, meaningful lives. And so I think favelas talk to that because they're very, very wealthy in all those other things. And so if we don't put monetary value on those, and that's why it's easy to evict them or see them as lesser. So it's good to think about those things if you can.
I was just wondering, in the favelas, and maybe in the larger ones, or not, but and it sounds like your first presentation is not often certainly. But are there cases where like a market develops for people to like, or maybe a better way of phrasing it, when the properties change hands, like you said, I know lots of times it's generational or things like that. But I'm sure there are cases where it's not generational, and for some reason there's just one, and someone would like to take that opportunity to use that structure in that space. Is there like a miniature market that sort of happens like within the favelas for people exchanging property?
Sure, no, absolutely. Yeah, sorry if I gave the impression it's not like that. There's a very robust real estate market in the favelas. It's just affordable because you don't have the land titles. If you add the land titles in the favelas in a wealthy area, then that market goes up to whatever the value is of the land in the formal market. Then you have gentrification and so on. That happened in the pre-Olympic period, and that's what led us to start the Community Land Trust project, was when we were looking for solutions, because there were communities fighting against titles because they thought they knew it would bring gentrification. So you were going to have people that were fighting to stay precarious because they didn't see a better alternative, because they wanted to stay where they were. And it reminded me of Boyle Heights. I think it's not Boyle Heights. There's a neighborhood in Los Angeles where people fought, where people were, with gentrification, were fighting against development because they knew that was going to kick them out. So you don't want people to be fighting against development that might actually be good for them. The problem is if it's there, not for them, right? Are we as planners trying to develop land or communities, human beings, people? What's our end goal? And if it's the end goal is people, then we should be thinking about who's there and how do we serve the people who are there and other people who can join them, but not displace them. So I didn't mention this, I'm originally from Brazil, but I moved to Washington, D.C. when I was 6, so I grew up in Washington, D.C., and then I moved back to Brazil 23 years ago. And growing up, Washington, D.C. when I was growing up was 80% African American. Now it's 40-something%. So going back there over my lifetime, I've seen this process, it's like, look how developed it is. Look at the tax base, yeah, but where are the people? Where's the culture? Where are the people who built the city who, now they're in another county. Okay, well, is that better for them? No. What happened here, right? And this gets back to the issue of rootedness and history and how much we value that. And and just adding another piece to this, economists met one of the big, big economic widely used measurement of economic progress is mobility. But what about permanence? What about stability? What about community? What about all of these things? When we live in a place and we're used to it being cold because we've been here for generations, and then it starts getting warmer, we say, uh-oh, something's wrong. But if we're moving in and people are constantly coming in, leaving, humans don't realize what's going on to the planet, partly because we're moving around so much, we don't have that connection anymore. So I just want to, question some of these principles that we apply all the time blindly, like the idea that mobility in itself is a good thing. It can be good, but it can also be problematic if it means people are moving out of their established neighborhoods or off their ancestral lands, or et cetera, et cetera. Sadly, yeah, the militias. We talked about these vigilante police mafias. They've been, remember the slide where I was like, this is a museum, it's not really like this anymore? That's a community where the militias, I took that photo about 10 years ago. The militias have come in and it's like 5, 7 story high. They've told people, get out of your house that you built, and the people had an option. We'll give you an apartment in the building we're gonna put here. And these are off-duty police, so they get, there's nobody's gonna crack down on them. And then they build, and one of these buildings fell last year. Yeah.
That when we buy a house from a developer, we can know that to some degree that's trustworthy. They
Yeah.
can buy and sell to another person as well.
Yeah.
That's where I was.
That gets back to the issue of the getting past the sweet spot, because the militias are past the sweet. This is an example of where the development that they're creating in some communities where it's this, and they don't care if people are safe, and they don't care if, whereas if you were building over generations, you were constantly improving the quality of your house. You were making it safer. You were making it better for your families. Yeah. And that started happening literally in the last decade. So that's some of the chaos going too far. Yeah.
I think that's a good time to end. Thank you so much, Theresa, for the presentation, and thank you everybody for your questions. I think a lot of these topics, well, sometimes are far away, especially, let's say, geography-wise, but they're very much human and connected to all of us. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.